The grand halls of the Majestic Queen shimmered under golden chandeliers, its opulence masking the silent menace lurking beneath. Agatha Marple stood at the edge of the ballroom, her keen eyes sweeping across the sea of glittering guests, one of whom had blood on their hands. A man had died, his final breath stolen in the dead of night, and now, hidden in the shadows of deception, a masterful mind played a dangerous game. But what they didn't know was that Agatha was already watching, already listening. The pieces were shifting, the facade beginning to crack, and before this voyage reached its final port, she would unmask the truth. Because in a world of lies, only one certainty remained: murder always left a trace. The Majestic Empress rested upon the Thames like a regal swan, its pristine white hull gleaming under the pale winter sun, a vision of elegance and silent grandeur. Below on the bustling dock, stewards moved swiftly, their practiced efficiency resembling a carefully orchestrated ballet, as they carried trunks and cases belonging to passengers of wealth and status. Fur-draped ladies, sharply dressed gentlemen, and couples whispering in hushed tones ascended the gangway, their expressions a mixture of anticipation, impatience, and, if one looked closely enough, a certain apprehension. But among them, one figure stood apart. Agatha Marple, wrapped in a modest woolen coat, carried nothing but a small well-worn suitcase, its aged leather handle betraying years of travel. To an untrained eye, she was unremarkable, just another passenger, but to those who truly noticed, and few ever did, there was an undeniable sharpness in her clear blue eyes, an ever-watchful gaze that held a quiet yet unshakable authority. Inside, the Majestic Empress was a world unto itself, polished marble floors reflecting the glittering glow of an enormous crystal chandelier, gilded railings spiraling up the grand staircase, and a hum of indistinct conversation mingling with the rhythmic thrum of the ship's powerful engines. A steward appeared at Agatha's elbow with impeccable timing. "Allow me to escort you to your cabin, madam." His voice was polite, rehearsed, and entirely unassuming. "Thank you," Agatha replied, her tone warm but eyes watchful. Her gaze flickered over the other passengers, an elegant woman trailing the delicate scent of an expensive perfume, a wiry man gripping his pocket watch as though time itself might betray him. A young couple whispering conspiratorially as though sharing a secret too fragile to be spoken aloud. Agatha had long mastered the art of reading people, and in each fleeting glance, she caught glimpses of hidden tensions, unspoken fears, and the unmistakable weight of concealed motives. As the steward led her through the lavish corridors toward her modest cabin, Agatha allowed herself a small knowing smile. She had boarded the Majestic Empress under the guise of seeking a peaceful holiday, but she harbored no illusions. Where wealth and ambition converged, intrigue was never far behind. It was only a matter of time before the ship's opulence would be stained by something far less refined. That evening, the grand dining hall was a vision of luxury, a cavernous space adorned with shimmering mirrors and golden accents. Waiters glided between tables with military precision, balancing silver trays laden with delicacies that filled the air with rich, tantalizing aromas. From a raised platform, a string quartet played a delicate waltz, its graceful melody weaving through the soft murmur of voices and occasional bursts of laughter. Agatha sat at a table near the center, an unobtrusive presence that allowed her to observe without attracting attention. Around her, passengers revealed glimpses of their private lives. An American businessman boasting loudly while his wife's strained smile barely concealed her growing irritation, a young artist sketching discreetly on a napkin, his eyes frequently darting toward the striking woman dining alone 2 tables away. But the air shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, as the doors at the far end of the hall swept open with dramatic flourish. Sir Reginald Hawthorne entered, flanked by his ever-present valet, a severe-looking man with the bearing of a former soldier. The shipping magnate and steel tycoon exuded an unmistakable aura of command. Broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, with a silver mustache groomed to perfection. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to dominance. Whispers rippled through the room, hushed murmurs carrying rumors of his immense wealth, his ruthless business dealings, and the legendary collection of rare artifacts he kept under lock and key. Some admired him, some despised him, but no one ignored him. As he strode toward the captain's table, pausing only to exchange pleasantries with the officers, Agatha noted the way his gaze lingered a moment too long on a young woman at a nearby table. She quickly averted her eyes, her cheeks flushing as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Agatha's lips curved into the faintest smile. Men like Sir Reginald were rarely as invincible as they appeared. She took a sip of her tea, her fingers light on the porcelain cup. The ship had barely begun its journey, yet the undercurrents of tension had already begun to swirl beneath the surface. She had a feeling that before long, the majestic Empress would have far more to offer than fine dining and dazzling chandeliers. There would be secrets, there would be whispers, and inevitably, there would be blood. As dawn stretched pale fingers across the endless ocean, the majestic Empress sailed through calm waters, its passengers stirring to the gentle chime of the ship's morning bells. The grand corridors, once alive with laughter and conversation the night before, now carried only the muffled footsteps of stewards tending to their early duties, the air thick with the lingering scent of expensive cigars and forgotten whispers. William Griggs, a seasoned steward whose punctuality was as precise as the ship's own ticking clocks, approached Sir Reginald Hawthorne's cabin at exactly 8 a.m., a silver breakfast tray balanced in his steady hands. Black coffee, lightly buttered toast, a side of marmalade. The powerful tycoon had made his preferences abundantly clear the previous evening, his booming voice leaving no room for misinterpretation. Yet, as Griggs rapped on the door, the usual barked response did not follow. A pause, then a louder knock. Silence. A strange unease prickled at the back of his neck. Sir Reginald was not a man to be late for anything, least of all his own breakfast. Swallowing down his apprehension, Griggs pulled the master key from his pocket, a privilege he rarely exercised, and turned the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a scene so disturbingly still that for a fleeting moment, Griggs wondered if his eyes were deceiving him. Sir Reginald sat in his grand armchair by the window, the morning light casting an eerie glow upon his face, his head lolled to one side, his half-open eyes staring into a void that no longer stared back. At first glance, he could have been napping, save for the unnatural stiffness, the vacant expression frozen in quiet horror, a dead man with the ocean stretching infinitely beyond his lifeless gaze. The tray trembled in Griggs' grip before he set it down with a soft clatter, his fingers instinctively reaching out to touch the tycoon's shoulder. Ice cold. His breath caught in his throat, and then it came, a shout for help that echoed down the corridors like a sudden gunshot in the hush of the morning. Within moments the ship's doctor, Oliver Wainwright, arrived, his perpetually furrowed brow deepening as he knelt beside the body, his movements brisk yet carrying the weight of inevitability. "It appears to be a heart attack," he announced, his voice clipped, his fingers barely lingering before he rose to his feet. Sudden, but not impossible. Yet Griggs, pale and visibly shaken, swallowed thickly. "But sir, he was in such good health last night. He even danced a little after dinner." The doctor barely spared him a glance. "Even the strongest men fall to the unexpected," he said curtly, already reaching for his medical bag. It might have ended there. Sir Reginald's death recorded as an unfortunate but unremarkable tragedy, had Griggs not noticed the safe. Embedded into the cabin's mahogany-panelled wall, the small, impenetrable vault had been the object of its owner's boastful display the previous evening, and yet now, the heavy door hung open, empty. The sight sent a chill through the steward's spine. He hesitated before stepping forward, peering inside, his breath catching as realization struck. Gone. Everything gone. Priceless artifacts, or so Sir Reginald had claimed, treasures he guarded with the paranoia of a man who knew what true wealth meant. The doctor frowned, stepping closer, the air between them thick with something unspoken. "Are you certain?" he asked, voice low, wary. Griggs turned, his face pale as death itself. "Absolutely." A heavy silence fell between them before Wainwright's jaw tightened. "Inform the captain, immediately. And for now, keep this quiet." But Griggs knew as surely as the cold weight of dread settling in his gut, that silence would not last long. Someone, somewhere on this ship, had been waiting for this very moment, and murder, theft and deception had just set sail aboard the Majestic Empress. By mid-morning, the news of Sir Reginald Hawthorne's sudden demise had slithered through the Majestic Queen like an unseen tide, seeping into every crevice of conversation, coiling around hushed whispers, and lodging itself in the wary glances exchanged between passengers. Though the official word from the ship's officers was a tragic but natural passing, the murmurs told a different story, something unsettling, something that made even the most composed socialites clutch their pearls a little tighter. In the grand dining hall, where golden chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with fine silverware, the usual clatter of breakfast was subdued, replaced by a strained quiet. Servants moved with an unusual stiffness, eyes lowered, hands steady but hesitant, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile illusion of normalcy. The guests, dressed in their elegant morning attire, spoke in conspiratorial undertones, their voices dipping into secrecy the moment an officer or steward passed by. Some whispered of a heart attack, others of foul play, but all agreed on one thing: this was no ordinary death. At a corner table, Agatha Marple, ever the silent observer, sat alone stirring her tea with an unhurried grace, the faintest gleam of calculated curiosity in her eyes. Unlike the others, she did not gawk or speculate openly, nor did she feign indifference. Instead she watched, listened, absorbed the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the nervous twitches of hands, the way certain individuals avoided making eye contact. It was a habit ingrained in her, this quiet collection of truths hidden beneath the surface. And at that moment, Agatha knew, something was terribly wrong. Her sharp gaze flicked toward the entrance just as a young steward hesitated near her table, his uniform crisp, but his posture betraying a burdened urgency. She caught his eye, offering a gentle yet deliberate nod. The steward swallowed, hesitated, then stepped closer, bending slightly as though adjusting a silver tray. "A rather peculiar morning, wouldn't you say?" she murmured, her voice just low enough to avoid unwanted ears. The young man hesitated again, glancing around before finally speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir Reginald, madam, gone. They're saying a heart attack, but," he exhaled, as if testing the weight of his own words before continuing, "his cabin safe was emptied." Agatha's hand paused on her teacup. The china, delicate and refined, felt unusually cool beneath her fingertips. A death and a theft in the same breath. Coincidence rarely operated in such tandem. Slowly she placed the cup back onto its saucer with meticulous care. "How unfortunate," she murmured, but inside her mind, the pieces of an enigma had already begun shifting, clicking into place like an intricate lock, awaiting the right key. Beyond the dining hall, the ship's elegant corridors bore the heavy weight of unspoken fears. Though the Majestic Queen still glided smoothly over the endless blue expanse, there was an undeniable shift, a crack in the illusion of absolute luxury. The once carefree elegance of its voyage was now tinged with an edge of paranoia, a ripple beneath the surface of opulence. In the lounge, Agatha settled herself near the grand piano, where the gentle melancholic strains of a slow waltz drifted through the air. Here, amidst the soft glow of golden sconces and the rich scent of leather-bound books, the ship's most intriguing players had begun assembling, each carrying their own unspoken secrets. Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, the estranged wife of the deceased, sat stiffly on a velvet chaise, a lace handkerchief trembling in her grasp. Her complexion was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line of grief, yet Agatha knew there was something controlled about her sorrow, something too precise, as though grief was a role she had prepared to play. And in her eyes, there was a flicker of something else, not sadness, not shock, but perhaps relief. Across the lounge, Charles Emery, the ever-charming art dealer, stood with effortless, a glass of bourbon in hand, his movements too casual for a man mourning an acquaintance. Hawthorne, dead. Never thought I'd see the day, he mused, swirling the amber liquid with idle amusement. His smirk, half hidden behind the rim of his glass, spoke volumes. He was not surprised, nor was he particularly saddened, but had he expected it? Or had he played a part? Further in the room, Dr. Hildegard Brunn, the sharp-eyed German archaeologist, sat hunched over a thick, leather-bound journal, flipping through its yellowed pages with unsettling focus. Her stoic features, framed by strands of unruly hair, were schooled into impassivity, but the slight tension in her jaw suggested something gnawed at her thoughts. Had Sir Reginald's death disrupted something, or had she perhaps anticipated this? And then there was Thomas Blake, the young steward whose nervous hands polished an already gleaming brass lamp, his movements brisk, almost frantic. His eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, again and again, as though he were counting down to something, or waiting for something yet to come. Agatha let her gaze drift between them all, watching without watching, listening without appearing to eavesdrop. These were the faces of a mystery in motion, the moving pieces of a puzzle not yet formed. Somewhere among them lay the truth. Sir Reginald Hawthorne's death was no accident, and Agatha Marple intended to prove it. A fine thread of tension wove through the air of the Majestic Queen, lingering like an unspoken omen. Though the morning sun spilled its golden light over the polished mahogany and velvet furnishings of the first-class lounge, its warmth did nothing to dispel the heavy unease that clung to the ship's passengers. Whispers of Sir Reginald Hawthorne's sudden demise had already infected every conversation, threading through the corridors, dining halls and smoking lounges like a slow-moving contagion. A heart attack, they said. Natural causes, they insisted. But Agatha Marple had seen too many well-timed deaths to believe in mere coincidence. Her knitting needles, usually clicking in a steady rhythm, had stilled in her lap, their silence mirroring the weight of her thoughts. "Excuse me, madam." The interruption came softly, yet there was a strained edge beneath its politeness. Agatha looked up to find Millie Harper, the ship's bartender, standing beside her table, her posture composed yet betraying a subtle tightness in her shoulders. "Would you care for some tea? Or perhaps, given the morning's events, something stronger?" Agatha studied her carefully before offering a measured smile. "Tea, please." Millie inclined her head, but as she turned away, Agatha noted the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the tension in her usually graceful movements. A woman accustomed to holding secrets. And today, it seemed she was holding more than one. As Agatha resumed her knitting, her mind moved faster than her fingers, weaving together stray observations, glances, and hesitations into something resembling a pattern. Lady Eleanor's delicate fragility, Charles Emery's carefully veiled amusement, Dr. Hildegard Braun's unreadable stoicism, Thomas Blake's nervous energy. None of them were grieving in the expected way, and yet the deeper tension that hung over the ship was not born of sorrow, but of fear. The entrance of Captain Lionel Harrington into the lounge cast a new shadow over the already tense atmosphere. A man of towering presence, his uniform immaculate, his expression a mask of unwavering control, he carried with him the unmistakable air of someone bearing unwelcome news. The murmurs softened as the gathered passengers instinctively straightened, watching him with wary expectation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrington began, his voice steady but edged with measured authority, "as you are all aware, Sir Reginald Hawthorne has passed under sudden and tragic circumstances." However, he paused, letting the weight of his next words settle before continuing. "It has come to our attention that his private safe was forcibly opened, and its contents are missing." The statement hit the room like a gunshot muffled by velvet. A ripple of reaction moved through the assembled company. Some gasped, some shifted uneasily, and others, like Agatha, simply watched. Listened, not to the words, but to the silences that followed. Charles Emery, ever the opportunist, leaned forward slightly, a knowing gleam in his eye. "And what exactly was taken, Captain?" His tone was casual, but the hunger beneath it was unmistakable. Harrington's jaw tightened. "A collection of rare artifacts, acquired by Sir Reginald during his travels in the Middle East and Africa. Priceless relics." His voice grew measured, almost cautious. "There have been speculations about their origins, and suggestions that they may not have been acquired through strictly legal means." A new undercurrent of unease pulsed through the lounge. "Dr." Hildegard Braun's fingers tensed ever so slightly on the edge of her journal. Lady Eleanor's already pale complexion seemed to blanch further as she pressed her lace handkerchief against her lips. Meanwhile, Thomas Blake, the young steward, stole a furtive glance at the clock, a glance that did not go unnoticed by Agatha. Why the fixation on time, counting down to something, or someone? Harrington's sharp gaze swept the room, pausing briefly as it met Agatha's. The flicker of silent recognition passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that despite her quiet demeanor, she was the one who would see beyond the veil. By the time the meeting adjourned, the lounge had become a different kind of battlefield. Conversations had shifted, alliances were subtly forming, and fear had settled more deeply into the crevices of the ship. Secrets were unraveling, one careful thread at a time. Agatha, still seated near the grand piano, let her fingers brush absently over the soft yarn in her lap, her mind already knitting together the truth hidden within the lies. Sir Reginald's death had been a spark, and soon enough, the fire would follow. The ocean stretched endlessly, a dark, shifting expanse beneath a sky heavy with secrets. The Majestic Queen bathed in the ghostly silver of the moon, cut through the waves like a silent predator. Inside, the ship's first-class lounge exuded an air of forced normalcy, though beneath the glittering chandeliers and soft hum of conversation, unease curled like unseen smoke. Agatha Marple, ever the quiet observer, moved through the space with the unhurried grace of someone who understood the power of stillness. People feared silence more than words, because silence made them think. She found Lady Eleanor sitting by the grand windows, her fragile frame outlined against the vast, unknowable sea. A woman lost in thought, or in something deeper. Agatha approached with the soft tread of someone who never wished to startle. "Such a dreadful business," she murmured, easing into the chair beside her, drawing her knitting into her lap. "Sir Reginald's death, I mean. You must be devastated." Lady Eleanor turned, her expression carefully arranged, a delicate balance between sorrow and restraint. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a shock." Agatha let the silence stretch, a well-placed pause often revealing more than any question could. "He was quite the collector," she continued. "Those artifacts of his, they must have been a point of pride, a flicker of something." Hesitation, unease, crossed Eleanor's face before she tightened her fingers around the lace handkerchief in her lap. "He was very proud of them," she admitted at last, "though I dare say his methods of acquisition left much to be desired." Agatha's knitting needles clicked softly as she spoke. Were there ever disputes over them? People who might have felt wronged? Eleanor's lips parted, but then she hesitated. Too long, and when she finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "I wouldn't know. Reginald kept his dealings very private. A lie, or at least not the full truth." Agatha filed the evasion away. Across the room, Charles Emery lounged by the bar, his fingers wrapped around a glass of cognac, swirling the amber liquid with the ease of a man who had seen much and regretted little. Agatha approached him next, her tone light, conversational. "You seem remarkably composed, Mr. Emery," she observed. "One might almost think you were unaffected." Charles glanced at her, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "One must maintain a certain detachment, Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "particularly in delicate situations. Grief and panic serve no one." Wise words. Agatha inclined her head, "though I wonder, Was your relationship with Sir Reginald one of mutual admiration, or something else entirely? Charles chuckled, the sound charming yet hollow. Admiration, hardly. He took a measured sip of his drink. Reginald and I had our differences. He was a shrewd man, and let's just say, he didn't always play fair in business, so there were conflicts. Charles shrugged, a nonchalant lift of his shoulders, though his grip on the glass was just a fraction too tight. Nothing out of the ordinary, but if you're suggesting I had a motive for... He waved a hand, dismissive. Let's not get carried away, Miss Marple. Deflection, a little too practiced. Agatha did not press further, but her suspicions sharpened. Finally she sought out Dr. Hildegard Braun, the archaeologist, who sat in a stiff-backed chair near the corner, her leather-bound notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She barely looked up as Agatha approached, though a slight nod acknowledged her presence. You must have been familiar with Sir Reginald's collection, Agatha remarked, her tone pleasant. Dr. Braun did not hesitate. I was. Her voice was clipped, precise. It was impressive, though much of it was obtained through dubious means. And you disapproved of those means. For the first time, Dr. Braun's eyes flicked up, sharp and calculating. Any scholar worth their salt would disapprove. Those artifacts belong in museums, not in private collections. And yet, Agatha pressed, you never challenged him directly. The briefest tightening of Dr. Braun's mouth, the smallest shift of her posture. I prefer to avoid unnecessary conflicts, Miss Marple. Sir Reginald was a powerful man. A pause, then lower, almost to herself. And it is dangerous to cross powerful men. A woman of principle, but also one who had learned when to stay silent. By the time the lounge began to empty, Agatha's mind was working faster than ever. Each conversation had revealed a truth, but also a lie. Every passenger had their secrets, their grudges, their reasons, but which of them had turned resentment into murder? The Majestic Queen drifted deeper into the night, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond its gilded halls, but inside the ship, behind velvet curtains and polished doors, the truth was unraveling, and Agatha Marple would be there to catch every loose thread. The Majestic Queen drifted through the midnight waters, a floating palace wrapped in silence, its corridors stretching like arteries through the heart of something unknowable. Agatha Marple moved through its depths with careful, measured steps, her silk robe whispering against the polished floor. Sleep had eluded her. The weight of stolen artifacts, the unreadable expressions of Lady Eleanor and Charles Emery, and the chilling detachment of Dr. Hildegard Braun refused to be silenced. Each unanswered question hung in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. But then she saw it, a shadow slipping from the corridor leading to Sir Reginald Hawthorne's sealed cabin. The figure moved swiftly, its overcoat a dark ripple against the dim light of the sconces. Agatha's pulse quickened, but her expression remained serene, a lifetime of observation keeping her composed. They hesitated, just for a second, as if listening. Then, with practiced ease, they vanished down the corridor leading toward the crew quarters. Agatha did not pause. With the silent grace of a hunter, she set down her knitting bag on a nearby bench, a subtle marker should she need to retrace her steps, and followed. The opulence of the upper decks melted away as she descended into the ship's lower levels, where gleaming chandeliers were replaced with bare bulbs that flickered under the strain of the ship's constant motion. The air was thick, the scent of oil, damp wood, and the distant tang of salt water pressing in, and the hum of the great engines rumbled beneath her feet. Whoever she was following knew this part of the ship well. The shadowed figure turned a corner sharply, their pace quick, yet controlled, careful not to draw attention. Agatha slowed, flattening herself against the cold steel wall. A soft creak, almost imperceptible, reached her ears. A door. They had gone inside. Agatha exhaled, her sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor before stepping forward. The storage room door stood slightly ajar, its hinges still swaying with the ghost of movement. Carefully she pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The room was small, lined with shelves stacked with crates bearing the ship's emblem. A single hanging bulb cast long skeletal shadows across the wooden floor. The space was empty, or so it seemed. Agatha's gaze swept the room, noting the faint indentations on a nearby crate, recently disturbed. Her fingers brushed against the surface, coming away with a thin residue of oil. Odd. Something had been placed here, then swiftly removed. But what? She took another careful step, her foot barely brushing against the ground, when something caught her eye. A small scrap of fabric, half hidden beneath a shelf, its edges torn and frayed. Dark, fine, expensive, likely from a jacket. Agatha bent down, plucking it between her fingers before slipping it into the pocket of her robe. A clue, but to what end? Before she could investigate further, a clatter of boots on distant metal stairs sent a pulse of awareness through her. Whoever had been here was long gone. For now, Agatha inhaled deeply, the scent of oil and damp wood pressing against her senses as she stood in the quiet of the storage room, the puzzle pieces shifting in her mind. Someone had been in Sir Reginald's sealed cabin. Someone who had come straight here afterward. But why, and what had they taken? By the time she made her way back to the upper decks, the corridors were eerily still, the hush of the late hour wrapping around her like a veil. She retrieved her knitting bag from where she had left it, her face composed, a mask of quiet contemplation that revealed nothing of the storm in her thoughts. As she reached her cabin door, her fingers hovered on the brass handle, a slow smile curving her lips. Secrets had a way of surfacing, and on a ship like this, they had nowhere to hide. With one final glance down the corridor, she stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. Tomorrow, she would have her answers. The Majestic Queen's grand lounge pulsed with an undercurrent of unease, its once lively murmur dampened by whispers of sudden death and silent accusations. Agatha Marple, seated near the gilded fireplace, observed the shifting social currents with the keen eye of a sparrow watching the winds. The air smelled of polished mahogany, faint perfume, and the distant salt of the sea, but beneath it lurked something more elusive, the scent of deception. People rarely lied outright. Agatha knew they merely reshaped the truth, omitting the pieces that mattered most. Her first subject was Lady Eleanor, seated by the great bay window, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the rim of her untouched teacup. Draped in a gown of pale blue silk, a shade just a little too extravagant for mourning, she was a portrait of delicate composure, her grief quiet, yet curated. Agatha settled beside her, the soft click of her knitting needles filling the silence before she spoke. "What a dreadful shock this must be, Lady Eleanor," she murmured, her tone warm with sympathy. "To lose your husband so suddenly, and aboard a ship, no less." Lady Eleanor sighed, the sound more resigned than sorrowful. "We had been estranged for years, Miss Marple." Her voice was measured, a touch too careful. Grief is a peculiar thing. One does not mourn what was lost, but what might have been. Agatha's needles paused, just for a breath, before resuming their steady rhythm. "And yet," she said mildly, "the bond of marriage is not so easily severed, is it? Tell me, did you have the opportunity to speak with Sir Reginald during the voyage?" Eleanor's fingers tightened, briefly, almost imperceptibly, before relaxing once more. She turned her gaze toward the sea. "No," she said softly, "he avoided me, as was his custom." A faint bitter smile touched her lips. "I suppose the only surprise is that he did not leave some dramatic insult for me in his will." Her voice turned wry. "Though there may still be time for that." Agatha chuckled lightly, but her gaze remained sharp. Eleanor's bitterness was evident, but was it masking something deeper, a flicker of relief, or fear? Across the room Charles Emery lounged near the bar, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his brandy glass. He greeted Agatha with a slow, practiced smile, gesturing for the bartender to pour her a sherry. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as silk, his expression that of a man utterly at ease. "You do bring a certain refinement to the room." Agatha accepted the glass with a polite nod. "You flatter me, Mr. Emery, though I imagine you're quite accustomed to refinement yourself, given your profession." Charles chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "Art is refined, yes," he said, "though the business of it, less so. Sir Reginald and I had differences in that regard." Agatha swirled her glass, watching him over the rim. "Ah, yes, his artifacts. I understand they were quite valuable." She let the words hang, soft as a whisper, valuable enough to make enemies perhaps. Charles's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened just slightly. Reginald was an astute collector, but not always a scrupulous one. It's no secret that he and I operated in adjacent markets. Agatha tilted her head, and did those markets ever overlap? Charles's fingers tapped a slow, deliberate beat against his glass. Then his smile widened, charming, practiced, but just a little too careful. "Only briefly, Miss Marple, and always to our mutual benefit." At a small table near the fireplace, Dr. Hildegard Braun sat rigid as a marble statue, flipping through a heavy book with precise, deliberate movements. The thin spectacles perched on her nose gleamed in the dim light as she turned a page. Agatha approached with her usual quiet grace, her knitting momentarily set aside. "Dr. Braun," she greeted warmly, "I hope I'm not interrupting." The historian glanced up, her eyes cool, assessing. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Please sit." Agatha lowered herself into the chair opposite. "I understand you and Sir Reginald shared a professional acquaintance?" Dr. Braun's lips pressed into a thin line. "I wouldn't call it an acquaintance exactly." Her tone was clipped, precise. "I led several excavations in Mesopotamia where Sir Reginald acquired his so-called treasures." A pause, then colder, sharper. "Let's just say we had differing views on the ethical boundaries of such acquisitions." Agatha's gaze softened, a calculated kindness. "And were these differences ever resolved?" Dr. Braun's eyes flashed, just for a moment. Then she shut her book with a quiet finality. "Hardly," she exhaled, slow and measured. "Sir Reginald was a man who took what he wanted. And men like that." She met Agatha's gaze, something dark and knowing lingering in her expression. "They eventually take from the wrong person." Agatha did not look away. The room swelled with whispers, the unspoken weight of things left unsaid tightening around them like an unseen hand. As Agatha rose, her thoughts wove together like the threads of her knitting, delicate, intricate, forming the shape of something unseen. Secrets, she thought, had a way of unraveling, and here on this ship, there was nowhere left to hide. The Majestic Queen's opulent dining hall shimmered under the dim glow of crystal chandeliers, yet the once luxurious ambiance now felt heavy with unsaid words and silent tensions. Agatha Marple, seated near a carved mahogany screen, let her sharp gaze drift, not unlike a hawk circling its prey. Murder had a way of unsettling the comfortable, of peeling away the carefully constructed facades that people wore like fine silk. She needed only to listen, to watch, to unravel the truth hidden beneath half-spoken confessions. Her first stop was Dr. Hildegard Braun, whose rigid posture and tightly pursed lips suggested a woman accustomed to self-discipline, but now fraying at the edges. The thin flush creeping up her neck did not escape Agatha's notice. "It must have been difficult," Agatha murmured, her voice woven with quiet understanding, "watching those artifacts taken from their rightful place." Dr. Braun's grip tightened around her book, her knuckles paling. "Difficult does not describe it," she bit out, each syllable measured. Her pulse flickered at her throat, betraying something deeper, rage, perhaps, or guilt. Agatha said nothing, merely letting the moment stretch until it became unbearable. Then, with a practiced smile, she moved on. In a far quieter corner of the dining hall, Thomas Blake, the steward, stood polishing a silver candelabrum, his movements methodical but restless, his gaze flickering toward every entrance as if expecting something or someone. Agatha approached with the gentleness of a tide lapping against the shore. "Mr. Blake," she said smoothly, her smile disarming, "might I have a word?" Blake started, nearly dropping the fork he was holding, but recovered with a hasty nod. "Oh, of course, ma'am. Anything I can do to help." "You must be terribly shaken," Agatha began, her voice a lullaby of sympathy, "finding Sir Reginald like that." Blake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. It wasn't something I'd care to experience again, ma'am. He looked so cold. And yet," Agatha pressed, watching him carefully, "you seem more nervous now than one might expect. Did you notice anything unusual that morning? Or in the days before?" A hesitation, a flicker of something, fear, calculation. Blake's gaze darted to the side. "I wouldn't know, ma'am. I just do my job. Don't like to get involved." Agatha leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to something softer, more intimate. "Sometimes, Mr. Blake, it is the smallest details that make the biggest difference." Blake glanced around, as if weighing the risk of his words. Then, voice hushed, he whispered, "I saw someone." Agatha's pulse quickened. "When?" "Late that night," he admitted, "near Sir Reginald's cabin." He wet his lips, voice almost trembling. "They didn't see me, but I saw them." "Who?" Agatha's tone was gentle but unyielding. Blake shook his head rapidly, his hands tightening around the silverware as though grasping an anchor. I couldn't say. It was too dark." Agatha narrowed her eyes, but only offered him a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Mr. Blake. You've been very helpful." She returned to her usual seat near the grand piano, her mind weaving the strands of information into something coherent. Everyone had a motive, everyone had something to hide, but who among them had turned their resentment into murder? The Majestic Queen hummed as its great steel body sliced through the Atlantic, the gentle creaks of wooden panels and the distant murmur of the sea, the only company for those seeking a restless sleep. But Agatha Marple was wide awake. Seated at the small writing desk in her cabin, she let the soft glow of her reading lamp spill over her notes, its flickering light casting shadows that seemed to breathe in the dimness. An untouched cup of tea sat beside a neatly folded letter, but her thoughts were far from correspondence or comfort. Each conversation played back in her mind, words, glances, pauses, hesitations. Secrets, she had long learned, were like spider silk, delicate, intricate, invisible, until caught in the right light. And this ship, this gilded floating cage, was full of them. A faint scraping sound suddenly shattered her thoughts. Agatha's sharp gaze darted to the door. Something had been slipped beneath it. She rose without a sound, crossing the cabin with quiet precision, retrieving the folded piece of cream-colored paper. Turning it over in her hands, she noted its unremarkable texture, the absence of any identifying mark, save for a faint, lingering scent of tobacco smoke. Someone careful, someone cautious, but someone desperate. Slowly she unfolded the note. Jagged, uneven letters sprawled across the page. "Ask too many questions, and you may never reach New York." Agatha stared at the message, her expression unreadable, but her mind sharpening to a fine, dangerous edge. The handwriting, hurried, almost frantic, suggested either haste or an attempt at disguise. Yet the rich navy ink, the quality of the paper, spoke of someone with access to finer stationery, a contradiction, a deliberate choice. Agatha allowed herself a small knowing smile. The game had just changed, and someone aboard the Majestic Queen was very afraid of what she might uncover. The dim glow of the ship's lanterns barely touched the corners of Evelyn Carroway's cabin, casting jagged shadows that flickered with each gentle sway of the ocean beneath. She traced her fingers along the crisp edges of the note she had received, its ink still damp in places, smudged slightly where trembling hands had gripped it too tightly. "Turn back now before the tide swallows you whole." The warning was as cryptic as it was desperate, its words scrawled in a hurried, almost erratic script. She exhaled slowly, her breath a whisper against the silence that pressed in around her. Outside, beyond the thin wooden walls, the grandeur of the Empress Nocturne continued undisturbed, champagne flutes clinking, distant laughter pealing through the corridors, the soft hum of a waltz spilling from the grand ballroom. But beneath the veneer of luxury, something dark coiled unseen, a current of tension that twisted around the ship like an invisible tide. Evelyn knew fear when she saw it, and whoever had left this note had been drowning in it. She reached for her pen, sketching swift annotations in her journal, hand unsteady, nerves, or the rolling of the ship, ink pooling, expensive fountain pen, not a hurried stub of coal pencil, scent, something faint, varnish, smoking lounge nearby. A knock, 3 sharp raps against the door sent her pulse into a quiet sprint. She tucked the note into the folds of her journal before answering, her face a careful mask of calm. Standing before her, shifting anxiously on polished shoes, was Vincent Hale, a steward known for his precise demeanor. Tonight, however, precision had abandoned him. His collar sat slightly askew, his normally composed features drawn tight with unease. "Miss Carroway," he murmured, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside at her nod. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but—" He hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "I saw something last night, near the captain's quarters." Evelyn arched a brow, her interest sharpening. "Go on." "A figure, moving quickly." Too quickly, considering the hour, his voice dropped lower. "They were carrying something heavy." A pause, then almost as an afterthought, "and they smelled of sea salt and tobacco." Evelyn felt the weight of the note under her fingers once more. Sea salt, tobacco. The pieces were moving, shifting, aligning into something tangible, but the question remained, was she deciphering the mystery in time, or had she already stepped too far into its grasp? The hush of the dimly lit cabin was thick with the scent of polished mahogany and something faintly metallic, almost like old blood left too long to dry. Evelyn Carroway's gaze flickered over the pristine surface of the desk against the far wall, oddly bare, devoid of the usual clutter one might expect from a man like Tobias Everston. A meticulous mind, or a hurried hand. Her fingers brushed the edge of the leather blotter, the sheen of it betraying the subtle pressure marks of papers that had recently rested there. Whatever had been removed had left its ghost behind. She turned toward the washroom, her footfalls soundless against the thick carpet. The marble sink gleamed under the dim light, the mirror reflecting a version of herself she barely recognized. Lips pressed into a thin line, eyes sharp with calculation. As she reached for the towel rack, her hand paused. A damp cloth, still wet despite the passing hours. A deliberate touch, or a careless one. The faintest acrid scent clung to it, chemical, sterile, too sharp for mere cologne. She turned back to the main room, her mind threading the observations into something coherent. Kneeling by the armchair, her fingers traced over the plush weave of the rug, stopping at a slight ridge where the fabric had been disturbed. Someone had moved it, then replaced it just enough to seem undisturbed, but not enough to erase all traces. A nudge to the chair's leg revealed a faint scuff on the polished floorboards, hastily adjusted. An afterthought, she moved to the safe embedded in the wall, its heavy door slightly ajar, the yawning emptiness inside more telling than if it had been forced open. Her gloved fingers trailed along the lock's edge, pausing at the shallow, frantic scratches near the mechanism. Not the work of a skilled hand, not premeditated. Whoever had done this had acted in desperation. Evelyn exhaled slowly. The damp cloth, the shifted rug, the safe left gaping open, not locked shut. The scene had been crafted with intent, yet lacked the finesse of true deception. The pieces were misaligned. She turned toward the door, her lips curving into the barest of smiles. "Messy," she murmured under her breath. "They'll have to do better than this." Outside, the ship moved with the rhythm of the waves, the low murmur of voices in the grand lounge layered with the clinking of glasses and the soft strains of a piano. Tension coiled beneath the revelry, invisible yet inescapable. Evelyn crossed the polished floor, her eyes sweeping the room with quiet intent. Near the bar, Vincent Langley nursed a tumbler of whiskey, his gaze distant but his posture too controlled to be truly at ease. By the grand windows, Lady Margaret Blackwood sat stiff-backed, staring out at the endless black horizon, her gloved fingers unmoving against her lap. Between them stretched a space too deliberate to be accidental, a tension that spoke louder than words. Evelyn barely had time to process the observation before a voice cut through her thoughts. "Miss Carroway," came a low whisper. She turned to find Annabel Pierce, one of the ship's attendants, her expression edged with urgency. "I thought you should know. Someone saw Langley and Lady Blackwood arguing with Tobias last night." Evelyn's expression remained carefully neutral. "Did they hear what was said?" Annabel hesitated before shaking her head. "No. Just raised voices. It didn't sound pleasant." Evelyn nodded, filing the information away. "Thank you, Annabel, that's very helpful." Later, as she descended the narrow staircase toward the lower decks, the air thickened with the scent of sea brine and oil. A figure ahead froze at the sight of her. Thomas Bellamy, one of the stewards, his usual jittery energy dialed up to something bordering on panic. His fingers fumbled with a small wrapped bundle, his grip tightening as if shielding it from view. "Good evening, Mr. Bellamy," Evelyn said smoothly, her gaze dropping to the parcel. "And what might you be holding there?" "Nothing, Miss Carroway," he stammered, his voice too high, too thin. Her brow arched. "You seem rather protective of nothing." "May I?" His grip faltered. Then with a resigned exhale, he handed it over, his hands trembling. Carefully Evelyn unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small intricately carved figurine, no more than 6 inches tall, its surface worn with age yet unmistakably valuable. She turned it slowly in her palm, the weight of it oddly significant. "Interesting," she murmured, watching Bellamy's throat bob as he swallowed hard. "And where, pray tell, did you come across this?" Evelyn Carroway's gaze lingered on the crystal decanter at the bar, its amber liquid disturbed just enough to suggest a recent pour. The cut glass caught the flickering glow of the chandeliers above, casting fractured reflections across the polished mahogany. Across the lavishly adorned lounge, the tension crackled in the air, thick with unspoken suspicions, like the static before a storm. The muted strains of the string quartet in the corner did little to soften the charged atmosphere. If anything, the delicate notes only heightened the contrast between the outward civility and the lurking undercurrents of deceit. Lady Isabel Blackwood, poised with the fragile elegance of a woman accustomed to wielding silence as a weapon, met Lord Sebastian Langley's sharp gaze from across the room. A gloved hand trembled, so slightly it might have been missed by anyone less observant than Evelyn, as she lifted her teacup, though her expression remained impassive. Her porcelain features betrayed nothing, save for the way her grip tightened ever so slightly around the delicate china. Around them, the other guests of the Celestial Duchess feigned disinterest, their conversations continuing in hushed tones, but their ears were attuned to the growing discord. Subtle glances exchanged over rimmed glasses and feathered fans. Langley was enjoying himself, that much was clear. He reclined with an air of deliberate ease, a man who reveled in the unraveling of others. His smirk was measured, the glint in his eyes that of a predator toying with its prey. He swirled the contents of his glass before setting it down with practiced precision, his fingers tapping against the crystal in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. "Curious," Langley drawled, the single word heavy with unspoken insinuation. He let the moment linger, watching the anticipation ripple across the room. How conveniently fate intervenes, ensuring those most troubled by Lord Harroway's presence no longer need suffer his influence. A hush fell, the genteel clinking of silverware against fine china faltered, conversations stilled, and all eyes shifted, subtly, cautiously, toward Isabel. Her grip on her teaspoon tightened just slightly, the only visible sign that Langley's words had found their mark. She did not flinch. Instead she exhaled softly, placing her teacup back onto its saucer with exquisite grace. "An interesting perspective, Lord Langley," she replied smoothly, her voice carrying the practiced detachment of a woman too well versed in polite confrontations. "Though I do wonder what precisely you are insinuating." Langley's smirk deepened, but there was a flicker of something uneasy beneath his confidence. "Oh, merely an observation, dear Lady Blackwood. After all, there's the matter of that peculiar dispute between you and the late Lord Harroway, something about a rather significant piece of antiquity gone missing." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room like a slow-moving tide, intrigue mingling with apprehension. The weight of scandal pressed against the edges of propriety, straining to break free. Even Evelyn, whose presence was usually unnoticed unless she intended otherwise, felt the shift in the room's energy. This was no idle parlor accusation. Langley was stirring the pot, but perhaps unwittingly placing himself in the line of fire. She rose from her seat with a languid grace, her expression neutral but her mind racing. This was the moment to strike. "A rather reckless observation," she mused aloud, her voice light but edged with steel. The casual remark cut through the tension like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Langley turned toward her, his smirk faltering ever so slightly. "Miss Carroway, surely you aren't suggesting I am mistaken?" Evelyn took a measured step forward, pausing near Isabel's chair. "Not mistaken, Lord Langley, merely imprecise." A slow smile curved her lips as she glanced at the surrounding guests, ensuring her words carried the intended weight. She let the silence stretch, the anticipation tightening like a coiled spring. Then, in a voice barely above a murmur, low enough that those listening would have to strain, but clear enough that the impact was undeniable, she added, "You fail to account for your own proximity to Lord Harroway's chambers the night he died." A collective inhale swept through the room, the air thickening with the tangible weight of revelation. Eyes widened, hands stilled, a flicker of realization darted across the faces of those gathered. Langley stiffened, his carefully composed expression cracking at the edges, the easy confidence slipping just enough for Evelyn to see the pulse quicken at his throat. His fingers curled around his glass, his knuckles white. A baseless claim, he scoffed, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. A thin veneer of control coated his words, but beneath it, Evelyn sensed the first tremors of unease. Her smile did not waver. She took another step closer, her presence now fully commanding the room. "And yet," she continued, tilting her head ever so slightly, "the steward reports a misplaced set of cufflinks, yours I believe, found near the very same corridor." Langley's jaw clenched, and for a moment the only sound was the distant echo of waves lapping against the hull of the Celestial Duchess. Isabel, for the first time that evening, allowed herself a flicker of satisfaction. She sat back, watching Langley with a gaze that had shifted from one of defense to something far more dangerous, assessing, calculating. The balance of power had shifted. The whispers in the room no longer surrounded Isabel, but rather Langley himself. Evelyn held his gaze a moment longer before finally, deliberately, returning to her seat. The tension did not dissipate, it only thickened, taking on a different shape. The storm had only just begun. The lower deck corridors of the Majestic Empress bore little resemblance to the gleaming grandeur of the upper floors. Down here the air was damp, tinged with oil and brine, and the constant thrum of the ship's engine pulsed beneath the metal-plated floor like a restless heartbeat. Shadows flickered under dim overhead lamps, stretching and distorting as the ship swayed ever so slightly. It was the perfect place for secrets to be whispered and buried. Agatha Vale moved with quiet purpose, her steps deliberate as she positioned herself just beyond the narrow passage leading to the storeroom. Her patience was a weapon sharper than any blade, her silence deadlier than a shouted accusation. Moments later, she heard the hurried, uncertain footsteps approaching, hesitant, uneven, carrying the weight of a man already burdened by guilt. Thomas Gray, the ship's steward, emerged from the gloom, his wiry frame tensed as he clutched a small bundle of linens against his chest, his fingers gripping the fabric as if it might anchor him to something solid. "Mr. Gray," Agatha murmured, stepping into his path. Her voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. Gray flinched as though struck, his pale face thrown into stark relief by the flickering overhead light, drained of what little color remained. "Miss Vale," he stammered, his voice barely more than a breath. "I don't know what you think, but I think," Agatha interrupted smoothly, tilting her head ever so slightly, "that you have been rather preoccupied these last few nights. I think you were seen loitering near Sir Reginald's cabin just hours before his untimely demise, and I think," she paused, letting the silence press against him like a tightening noose, "that you've been handling certain private possessions of his." Gray's breath hitched. The linens slipped from his grasp, tumbling to the floor in a soft heap. His hands twitched as though considering whether to flee, to lie, or to confess. Agatha merely watched, her dark eyes cool and unyielding. "I didn't kill him." The words tumbled out in a strangled whisper, raw and desperate. "I swear on my life, Miss Vale, I never meant for any of this to happen." Agatha's expression did not change, though something in her gaze sharpened. "Then I suggest you start from the beginning." Gray swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a buoy in rough waters, his fingers curled around the edge of the metal railing seeking stability. "It started 3 nights ago," he whispered, as though afraid the very walls might betray him. "I found a note under my door, unsigned, but precise. It said I was to retrieve certain items from Sir Reginald's safe. If I didn't, they would ruin my sister. They knew she worked in the city, knew her debts, her struggles. They said if I didn't comply, they'd see her destroyed." Agatha remained motionless, though a flicker of something cold and calculating passed through her eyes. "And how, Mr. Gray, did you come to open Sir Reginald's safe?" A muscle in his jaw tightened. After a long shuddering breath, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small crude device, a makeshift lockpick, the metal worn from use. "I've had to learn certain skills," he admitted hoarsely, shame heavy in his voice. "Nothing serious, just small jobs, enough to get by, but they knew." Agatha took the tool from him, turning it over in her fingers before tucking it away. "And what was inside the safe?" Gray hesitated, his gaze darting toward the darkened corridor as though he expected someone, something, to emerge from the shadows. "Artifacts," he muttered. "Strange ones, small statues, aged documents, things I didn't recognize. I didn't ask questions. I wrapped them up and placed them in the storeroom, just as the note instructed. And then," Agatha's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a quiet force that compelled an answer. Gray exhaled shakily. "I tucked them inside a crate, marked for provisions. I thought that would be the end of it. But then," his throat bobbed as he swallowed, "the next morning Sir Reginald was dead, and I knew I'd made a terrible mistake." A long silence stretched between them. The ship groaned softly, the steady hum of the engine filling the empty space where denial might have once lived. Agatha regarded him carefully, her face unreadable. "Why didn't you come forward?" Gray let out a hollow, mirthless chuckle, rubbing a shaking hand over his face. "And say what?" "That I was blackmailed into robbing a dead man, that I was stupid enough to think I could outplay whoever set this in motion." His voice cracked. "No one would believe me, Miss Vale. I'm just a steward." Agatha's expression softened, slightly. She reached out, her gloved fingers resting lightly on his arm, a quiet reassurance. "You did the right thing by telling me," she murmured. "But listen carefully, Mr. Gray, whoever coerced you is not finished. They have already gone to great lengths to manipulate you. If they suspect you might become a loose thread in their carefully woven plan," she let the implication hang in the air. Gray swallowed hard. "What should I do?" "For now," Agatha stepped back, smoothing her gloves as if dismissing a speck of dust. You go about your duties as if nothing has changed. Speak to no one, and if another note finds its way under your door, you bring it straight to me. Gray hesitated, then nodded, his shoulders slumping in weary relief. And Miss Vale? Agatha paused, her gaze cool and unwavering. What if they come for me first? A slow, knowing smile curved Agatha's lips, though there was no warmth in it. Then Mr. Gray, she said softly, they will have quite a surprise waiting. The ship creaked, the metal walls seeming to press inward as though they too carried secrets of their own. The storm had only just begun. The sea air carried a biting chill as Eleanor Vale stepped onto the lower deck of the Elysian Star, her gloved fingers tightening around the folds of her coat. Below the grandeur of the ballroom and its glittering chandeliers, this part of the ship bore an unsettling stillness, the hum of the engines a low and steady murmur beneath her feet. Shadows stretched long in the dim corridor, flickering under the sway of a single hanging bulb. A faint rustle echoed from somewhere beyond the supply crates stacked against the bulkhead. Eleanor stilled, her pulse quickening. She wasn't alone. A measured step forward. The scent of salt and machine oil thickened in the air. Miss Vale. The voice was smooth, almost amused, but edged with something sharper beneath the civility. From the shadows emerged Lucian Graves, the enigmatic antiquities dealer, whose presence on this voyage had always seemed too convenient. His sharp eyes glinted as he leaned lazily against a crate, the dim light catching the silver chain of his pocket watch. You seem rather far from the champagne and waltzes. Eleanor forced a smile. As do you, Mr. Graves. Her gaze flickered to his hand, where a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth rested against his palm. A discreet size, yet carrying the weight of something significant. An interesting find, she noted, feigning indifference. I assume it didn't simply fall into your possession. Graves chuckled, an infuriatingly calm sound. You give me too much credit, Miss Vale, or perhaps too little. He stepped forward, his polished boots silent against the floorboards. Tell me, do you believe in fate? I believe in consequences, Eleanor countered, shifting subtly to keep distance between them. Like those that tend to follow stolen relics. A shadow crossed Graves' expression, but he recovered quickly. Ah, but one must define theft, mustn't they? After all, Sir Alistair Lockwood, may he rest in peace, acquired certain artifacts under questionable circumstances. The mention of Sir Alistair sent a ripple of unease through Eleanor. The esteemed historian had been found dead in his cabin just 2 nights prior, his door locked from the inside, his prized collection of ancient relics mysteriously absent. A tragedy they'd called it, a stroke perhaps. But Eleanor knew better. Convenient that you bring up Sir Alistair, she said, her voice even. Considering you were the last to speak with him before his unfortunate demise. Graves' lips twitched into something between amusement and annoyance. Come now, Miss Vale. If you insist on casting suspicion my way, at least be thorough. I wasn't the only one with a vested interest in his collection. Captain Rothwell's late-night dealings. Lady Winthrop's mysteriously deep pockets. And, dare I say, your own presence on this voyage. Eleanor held his gaze. This was a game of chess, and Graves had just tipped his hand, revealing not just his knowledge, but his wariness. He wasn't merely here to profit off stolen antiquities. He was hunting something just as she was. The distant clang of metal against metal rang through the deck, a sound out of place, followed by the shuffle of hurried footsteps. Both Eleanor and Graves turned in unison. A third party, a silent observer. The hunter had just become the hunted. Eleanor's fingers brushed against the small dagger hidden in the folds of her coat. Graves exhaled slowly. It seems we're not the only ones prying into dead men's secrets tonight. The shadows around them seemed to stretch, the cold sea wind howling through the cracks in the steel. Something was coming, and Eleanor had a feeling that before this voyage ended, she would discover that Sir Alister's death was only the beginning. The Elysian Star was no longer just a luxury vessel slicing through the Atlantic. It had become a prison of secrets, a gilded cage where deception lurked beneath polished chandeliers and whispered behind closed doors. The grand ballroom, once filled with laughter and waltzing couples, was now the stage for a reckoning. The air crackled with tension as passengers gathered, their breath held, their gazes flitting between one another like wary animals sensing a predator in their midst. Eleanor Vale stood at the center, a figure of quiet authority, her presence commanding yet calm. "Sir Alister Lockwood's death," she began, her voice smooth yet firm, "was no accident." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Lady Winthrop stiffened in her seat, her delicate gloved hands tightening in her lap. Lucian Graves, leaning against the grand piano with his ever-present smirk, shifted slightly, as though testing the weight of the accusation. Dr. Alden Sharp, the ship's esteemed physician, remained impassive, though his sharp eyes flickered with something unreadable. And then there was First Officer Gideon Harlow, his face a mask of professional detachment, but his clenched fists betraying an edge of tension. The official cause of death was heart failure, Eleanor continued. But what if I told you it was carefully staged? She let the words settle. Sir Alister was murdered by an undetectable toxin, administered through a fine monogrammed handkerchief. When pressed to the skin, it seeped through, inducing cardiac arrest without a trace. Gasps punctuated the silence, and the weight of Eleanor's words pressed down on the room like a thick fog. She watched their reactions, measuring guilt, fear, defiance. Then slowly, she turned her attention to the first suspect. "Lucian Graves, you spoke of fate last night, Mr. Graves," she said, stepping closer. "I wonder, do you believe in irony? Because the very artifact you so desperately sought to smuggle, the Byzantine seal of Veritas, was the key to unraveling your own deception." Graves' fingers flexed slightly against the polished wood of the piano, his smirk returned, but it was thinner now, stretched tight over something darker beneath. "A charming theory," he drawled, "but utterly baseless." "Not quite," Eleanor countered. "Sir Alister had discovered your operation, hadn't he? He had traced the stolen relics back to you, and he intended to expose you the moment we docked in New York. That's why you needed him silenced. But you weren't alone in this, were you?" Her gaze swept over the room before landing on Dr. Alden Sharp. The doctor's jaw tightened slightly. "You provided the means," Eleanor continued, her voice measured. "Your medical expertise ensured the poison would be painless, seamless, nothing more than a sudden heart failure in the dead of night. You knew how to make a death look natural, but the question remains, why? What leverage did Graves have over you?" For the first time, a flicker of something like regret crossed the doctor's face, but he said nothing. And then Eleanor said, turning, "There's you, Mr. Harlow." First Officer Gideon Harlow remained still, but something in his eyes shifted. "The quiet officer, the one no one watches too closely," Eleanor mused. "You weren't just the courier, were you? You planted the artifacts, arranged the trade routes, ensured the perfect cover for the smuggling operation. And when Sir Alister became a threat, you decided his voyage had to end, permanently." The silence was electric. Harlow's fingers twitched. "Of course," Eleanor continued, "everyone played their part, some for greed, others for ambition. But what they failed to consider was that every crime leaves a thread, and I followed those threads straight to you." The doors to the ballroom swung open. The ship's captain, flanked by two stewards, stepped inside. The walls closed in. For a moment Harlow did nothing. Then, like a snake uncoiling, he moved. But Eleanor was faster, stepping into his path. "Going somewhere?" she asked, her voice low, her eyes unyielding. The room held its breath. Then Harlow exhaled a slow, chilling chuckle. "Impressive," he murmured. "But tell me, Miss Vale. What will you do with the truth now that you have it? Expose it, she answered without hesitation. A single nod from the captain, and it was over. Harlow, Graves and Sharp were escorted away, their once imposing figures reduced to mere shadows. The ballroom remained frozen in time as the weight of justice settled over the passengers. Outside, the Elysian star glided toward its final destination. The first fingers of dawn reached across the sky, painting the waters gold. Eleanor stood at the railing, the cold metal firm beneath her hands, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Some called the sea endless, but she knew better. Mysteries never truly end. They merely wait to be found.